am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, my top 5 favorite episodes plus top 10 most downloaded of 2024 revealed. I am joined by one of my wonderful listeners, Jen Singh, who has joined me on several episodes, most notably the ones on uncovering your core values and AI. In this episode, we share our top 5 favorite episodes from 2024, and at the end, I reveal the top 10 most downloaded episodes of the year. It was so fun hearing about Jen's favorites, and it turns out we had one in common. If you haven't had the chance to listen to all of the episodes from 2024, which I totally understand and I don't expect you to, this episode will be especially helpful. We dive into why we each loved certain episodes more than others, and I hope it will give you some great recommendations to add to your listening list. Please enjoy, and thank you for listening. Happy holidays. Jen, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to see you.
Thank you. I'm excited to see you too. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
I know, likewise. I've been looking forward to doing an episode with you. First of all, I'm amazed and not surprised at your approach, but I love it. Of course, it's you. You have to have this amazing way of approaching my task for you. It was hard for me to choose my top 5s. First I printed the list of all the episodes that I created, which is not hard to do. I just copy and paste from Libsyn, where I have all my files, into our Facebook group. I figured maybe it's better for people to see all the titles in the same place. And then what occurred to me was, wow, wait, there's so many titles. Maybe I can help people even better to group them together. And for me, it was kind of interesting too. I'm like, it seems like this year I covered this topic a lot, or this topic. I'm like, let me categorize and group them. And it was very revealing that I almost dedicated the same amount of time to the categories that were presented there. They were almost equal amount of episodes in each category, which was kind of surprising for me. Anyways, so I printed that list for myself at home so that I can sort. I'm a paper and pen type of person. I know you're a very digital person. As you can see my notes, it's all different colors and random things, but it helps me. So at first, I printed all the episodes. Then I circled with the red pen my top absolute favorites. Of course, they're all favorite, but obviously, there are the ones that resonate with me, that I love the guest, or I remember something potent or powerful inside. So those were 16 of them for me. And then I said, no, 16 is too large of a list. Let me narrow it down to 5. And that's where the trouble occurred. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. How do I choose the top 5? So that took me a while, and I started sort of like thinking, how can I discern? So eventually I chose like this. I went with the episodes that were very new and novel for me. I learned something earth-shattering, groundbreaking. It opened a new mind door for me. It was thought-provoking. It was challenging, or a new perspective emerged for me. I based my favorite episodes on that material because I do have a lot of favorite episodes. For example, Healing Insecure Attachment with Dr. Judy Ho. I love that episode, but would I choose that as my top 5? No, because I knew basically everything that we talked about attachment and things like that. It was great. I loved it. It was dynamic, but it's not in my top 5. So I hope this is clear how I chose my top 5. And what I'm hoping to do is, at first, we can take turns in sharing our top 5s and telling the listener why we chose those episodes briefly. And then we can reveal the top 10 most downloaded episodes of the year. And I am dying to know if my top 5 matches yours, or if your top 5 is in the top 10 list, because some of my episodes are in the top 10 because I have access to that information and you don't. So, do you want to start, or you have something else to say before we reveal our favorites?
May I suggest, instead of my 5 and then your 5, can we do 1 and 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 and 3?
That's what I said. Yeah.
And my top 5 are in no particular order because, as we've said many times, it was so hard to pick 5 that there's no way I could sort these. But the first one to talk about for me is the one about panic-proof holistic solutions about ending anxiety. I really loved that 4-step process that she talked about in there to reset anxiety. It was about calming the nervous system first, and there was lots of discussion in there about grounding and sensory tools. Before then, step 2, engaging the analytical mind and being able to think and engage with, here's what's really happening, and here's some options I have now. Not trying to do those thinking things until the nervous system has calmed down. That separation was really powerful for me. And then 3 and 4 was about reintegrating and then reframing and using those sensations as data. This anxiety that I was feeling is data to tell me good information. So those 4 steps were great, but then there was so much more in that episode. So that's why it made it in my top 5. I took notes on this episode. I went back to YouTube, in fact, where I can use AI tools connected to YouTube and get a really great summary of the episode from the YouTube transcript. So that was my first one. What was one of your top 5?
Wow, I got a comment on this one first. Well, I really liked that episode, and it is not in my top favorites for different reasons, but I really loved it. I really loved her book. She was so joyful, enigmatic, and energetic, and a wonderful guest. And her book is wonderful too. And I really loved the tools and everything it makes me happy that you found it useful and helpful, that you took notes. I know many people did. Colleen listened to that and she found it helpful. So I really am happy about that. One of my top 5 episodes is the episode with Dr. Moshe Bar. He's a cognitive neuroscientist in Israel. And the episode is called Mind Wandering. I can get you the exact title, but it's about his book and his approach, Mind Wandering. We talked about many different things. I really enjoyed this guest and the book, but the top things that I took away from it were the different mind states that we go into. And he talks about mindfulness, immersion, exploration, mind wandering, that there's nothing wrong with mind wandering, that we can't forcefully put ourselves in those mind states. But when we are, we can notice and acknowledge and enhance that experience. He somehow criticizes mindfulness a little bit, and I'm not going to go into detail how and why. He sort of normalizes this mind wandering experience. It's not like you're absent-minded or you have an ADD brain or something like that, but you can harness creativity, most importantly, through being in that mind state. And 47% of the time, our mind wanders. We're not present. It either ruminates, goes into the past, or it's anxious, goes into the future. We also talked about a practice called labeling to combat your negative thoughts. I love that practice very much. We talked about cognitive load, boosting your mood using free associations. And He showed me around his house where he lives. It's an igloo. It has a circular round shape. It was phenomenal. Then we talked about how space and environment affect our mood and vice versa. If you're in a good mood and you enter a space, which is not a well-designed space, you're still in your mood affects how you perceive that space, and vice versa. If you're in a negative mood, where I gave my daughter's example, where she goes to school and she says, I hate my school. It's not that the school is bad, it's just her mind state when she enters that place is negative, and it affects her perception of the space. We talked about curved spaces, how it affects our nervous system and the sense of safety. So it's a phenomenal episode, very rich, and I cannot recommend it enough.
That's awesome. I love that statistic about 47% of the time our mind is wandering and we're not present. That's certainly a challenge in the work that I do, where I'm a remote worker, a knowledge worker, and I sit at this desk a lot of the time, most of the time, and I'm making virtual calls like this one and presenting to audiences in my company like this, and trying to keep an audience present. It's so challenging. I should re-listen to that episode to see what I might be able to glean from it as a presenter. I hadn't thought of it from that angle. But yeah, that one isn't on my top 5. So it's kind of cool that we had 2 different ones right from the get-go.
Okay. What's your second favorite episode?
So with Yvette Erasmus, of course, it was our live event, The Art of Communication in Relationships. That was extra powerful for me because we attended the live event. And I say we because it was me and my daughter, who's 12, and my mom, who is a whole other generation removed from these ideas. So it was fantastic and completely memorable as an event, but also as a podcast. It's been a really awesome couple of weeks since we came back from that event and been able to talk in this common language, having this vocabulary of feelings and needs. And a couple of times I've even responded to my daughter's just everyday complaints with a question like, what is it that you're needing here? I can hear that you're frustrated. What is it that you're needing? And she knows now that's a shorthand for what are your needs? I'm not going to just listen to this complaint and respond to it in a reactive way. I'm actually looking for a way that I can help you here because we're on the same page. So that common language has been so powerful. I love nonviolent communication. I have been exposed to it since I met Yvette on your podcast a few years ago, just as a listener, not meeting her in any other way. But meeting her in person was just such a treasure. I really, really loved that episode.
I know. Meeting her was such a pleasure. What an honor. And she was so phenomenal. What an amazing human being. I spent time with her before the event, after the event, the next day, and she just blew my mind, as a human being and as a teacher. She's one of those rare teachers online. There's so many gurus and teachers. She's the real deal. She's the real package. She's so amazing. Yeah, that is not in my top favorite episodes because obviously it could be, but I didn't want to be biased and put the event. And, I'm like, okay, I have to choose a different one. I could have put that one in my top 5 list, but I chose not to because I was hoping that you're going to do it. I knew that you're going to put it on your top, and I wanted to be different from yours.
You know me so well.
I do. And that was a phenomenal event. I mean, listen, this was our second event in the same year, which was like crazy to begin with. And you came to both events, and it's just so nice. I was looking at my year and I'm like, wow, we had 2 live events this year. I mean, that's a big achievement, and so much work obviously went into it. But I think the one with Yvette, it just blew everyone away. And I'm like, how can I match that experience with another guest, a live event? Who is it going to be? And in my mind, it's swirling. It's going to be Yvette again. We can do another live event with the same guest. Why not? Because, she has so much to offer and we have so much to learn, and we can definitely deepen. Anyways, but the podcast 10th anniversary is coming up next year, and I am hoping to do a retreat or maybe celebrate in a big way, maybe in conjunction with a live event, or maybe take the live event on the road or something else. So I haven't finalized my ideas yet, but yeah, that episode was phenomenal in the live event. How about my rapping? Like I forgot about that already. Do you
I
want to
did not
share?
forget, Anna.
Do you want to say in a few words what was it like as a
Your rap was such a fun surprise, and it was a way to open the event in and give it this mood of just letting go of any fears that we might be judged for the comments we make or the problems that we bring to the conversation for discussion, because that it just really achieved that perfectly. I couldn't have imagined a better way to send that message than to dress up in street clothes that were baggy and a big old chain necklace. And man, you completely transformed into a rapper with just a few items of clothing that you tossed on. And then you rapped with the skill of a person of our generation, I will say. And that is to say, not much, but it was, again, just so fun. So thank you for showing that vulnerability, because it was precisely the right way to open the evening.
I know I worked so hard in learning the words. I mean, I wrote the song, I purchased this beat, the music to go with it, and I was practicing for days on end to memorize the lyric with the moves. I was doing the moves, and it was so hard. But after the event, there's no place for that rap. That song sort of died, and I'm like, oh, like I would get up every morning before the event and practice my song before I could do anything else. And then there was this emptiness, It was so fun to create it. And sort of, it was a mocking of this trauma language culture that we are immersed in. And yeah, it was fun. And I think it was exclusive for the people who came. We have the recording, and maybe at some point I can release it to the, not to the whole podcast. I don't want people to misunderstand it, because it was in that context that it worked, or maybe I can perform it again within a small circle of people, because I still know the words.
I bet you do after all that practice. My goodness.
I know. Okay, so enough about that. So my second favorite episode is with Dr. Frank Anderson, who is a Harvard trained psychiatrist, author of several books, and his memoir, To Be Loved, which was really groundbreaking, because a trauma expert, a trauma specialist, talks about his own trauma vulnerably and publicly. I think that's a unique lens, which is becoming trendy, because Dr. Peter Levine wrote his memoir, and it feels like all the trauma people are becoming more vulnerable and open about their own issues, because we all have traumas and things. And so I loved that book, and I loved him as a guest. He's so dynamic. He's so vibrant. I loved his personality. I invited him the second time. We did the holiday drama episode, which is a more recent episode. But this about the trauma episode, not that I didn't know things about trauma. He said a few things that he said it in a different way that were more resonant, or it was more powerful, right? He talked about, I think, a 3-step process in healing trauma. The number one being witnessing. Someone has to witness you telling your story, allowing yourself to be seen and heard. Second, having corrective experiences, which was a new language. And I love that. It's very understandable for the listeners. And the third, I believe, part is releasing, letting go of the pain and the burden. He talks about doing your own work a lot, healing yourself before healing the relationship with your parents. He also talked about the when to offer compassion to someone who is dysregulated, and when to offer empathy, which I found really, really, like, I knew it, but the way it was said, it was very clear cut and black and white. So it was very good what he said. What else was in that episode memorable? Let me look at my notes. Um, did you listen to that episode?
I did both of the Frank Anderson episodes, and I'm glad it's on your list because it was hard to not include it in mine to make room for some of the others I wanted. So that's one of the ones that nearly made it on my list as well. So I truly appreciated that. And then there were several different trauma episodes in this season, as you talked about categorizing them. So I certainly learned a lot about trauma, and I think one common thread that they all held was that healing is possible. And similar to the episodes about anxiety, that healing is possible. And what I mean by that is that it's more than just learning to cope with these feelings of anxiety or the after effects of trauma. Coping isn't the same thing as healing. And this collection of episodes made that distinction in a way that I haven't heard before. So it was a new idea for me, probably not for you and others in the field, but it was something I really appreciated learning this year.
Yeah, it's not a new idea for me because every time people say, why should I listen to your podcast? That's one of the things that come to mind, that healing is possible for everyone and blah, blah, blah. But I guess, what's interesting for me as the producer of this podcast, I mean, it's about trauma a lot and healing our childhood wounds and all of that. But I always want to bring a new approach, new lens, a fresh perspective, because I don't want my listener to be bored of the topic. I want them to learn and rediscover something new. And I hope I'm succeeding in that because I choose very carefully my guests. And I don't want to invite, because we're talking about the same topic. I mean, right? But I want to keep it new and novel, a new twist or level or something like that. Yeah, that's a challenge for me. And yeah.
Yes, and one thing that you often do, as you should in a podcast about parenting, is address the fear of how can I protect my kids from this thing, this trauma that we're talking about, because there are traumatic things that happen to our kids that we can't protect them from everything, and we shouldn't protect them from everything. Obviously, we want to protect them from trauma if we can. We can't always. And that can be very, very fear inspiring, but that fear doesn't have to paralyze. And there are things that we can do to support them through these very difficult situations. And our support can make all the difference as to whether they come out of those things traumatized or healed. And healing doesn't mean, of course, that we go back to what it was like before. It means that we can carry forward, we can move forward despite this change that has happened inside of us. A little bit like a scar on our skin, right? The skin heals and we no longer have to treat it quite so gently as we did when it was wounded. But it's not the same as it was before. We don't need it to be the same. We just need it to be healed, even if it's different after healing. So that was the part that I took away from, again, the collection of episodes. I think that together they all kind of led to that realization for me that I didn't have at that point.
Well, thank you for that. Wait, that was our second episode,
It
correct?
was.
Did you share your third episode yet?
I didn't.
Okay, what is your third favorite episode?
So I know for sure this isn't on your list because it's Indistractable with Nir Eyal.
Oh, yes, you are right. It is not.
I love your groan there because you even said during the episode how you disagreed with his premise. But I think your disagreement there is one of the things that made it so thought-provoking for me. I already knew that I liked his ideas and that I liked his book. It's something I had known about before your interview with him. And then when you continued questioning him about this idea about can everybody really have the level of agency that you're requiring for this model to work? And he didn't quite answer your question. I don't think he was coming at the question with the same lens that you were. And it really wasn't important. After a couple of attempts, it wasn't important anymore to get him to see what you were talking about.
May I interject here? And because otherwise I'm going to forget. You're right. And I criticized myself. After I listened to the episode, I had the thoughts, but I was not formulating my ideas well to push him. And he was dodging it, of course. And he's one of those guests who have the canned answers to the thing that they've written about. and blah, blah, blah. And I don't like these kinds of interviews usually, right? I want to have a different kind of conversation. But at the end, if you remember, he talked about him being a obese child and went to fat camp and blah, blah, blah. So he became a little vulnerable, but it was towards the end. And I would have loved to have that conversation instead of, the one that we had for 45 minutes. He was not chosen by me, this guest, by all means. It was introduced to me by another podcast guest I am friendly with. And I couldn't say no, because sometimes you just have to do favors for people in the industry, right? Because he's a friend, he's been on my podcast before, and he said, I think he would be a good guest for you. And I just couldn't say no because it was a group email. If it was individual, I would have said, no, I know who Nur Eyal is. Believe me, like, I don't want to have him on the podcast. What strikes me about this is people like this are a little rigid to my taste and too uptight about their theory. And his theory, his approach worked for him. Great. But you don't have to proselytize and make it this approach that works for everyone. That's what bothered me, that arrogant approach. And maybe that book works for like 30% of people. I have nothing against that. He has a lot of good things in his book. But I think for me, it was more of his personality that I had something, than
Didn't
the
click
actual.
with you. Yeah.
Yes, it did not, because I didn't choose him, right? Most of my podcast guests, I reach out, I choose them because I admire them or I respect their work. But this was through this introduction, and maybe I had a little resentment from the beginning. But so not to, hijack this conversation, please continue your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for that, because now that you mention, I do think that I detect that difference that you're talking about, where his answers at the earlier part of the episode were, like you say, I'm not sure that's the word I would use, but it's very
Rehearsed.
clear. Rehearsed.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
rehearsed.
It's clearly the thing he's talked about 100 times before, and he comes here and talks about the same thing with nothing new to add. I could listen to any podcast with him as a guest and hear the same thing. So I did appreciate at the end that it changed a little bit. But like I said, it was your disagreement that made this so thought-provoking for me. And I think the common ground that didn't emerge in the episode, we can talk about a little bit here if you want, is that sense of agency, which maybe if someone hasn't heard the episode, it talks about the concept that in order to avoid distraction, we have to recognize what it is that we do want to be doing. Where should we be having traction, right? And then being aware of the fact that I'm now off track, and then bringing ourselves back onto where it is we want to be. And that requires a lot of mental gymnastics to be able to do that, a lot of cognitive strength, and as you said, a strong sense of agency. And the common ground that I heard was that strong sense of agency. I agree with you that it's something that not everybody has, especially people who have different brain wiring, maybe from trauma or from something else. And that agency develops as part of the healing journey. Part of getting over trauma is the building and development of that strength. And until someone has achieved that, they might not be able to access tools like the ones that he described in this book. So that's how I see it, is that he starts with an assumption that's unstated, this assumption that we have this sense of agency already, and that we can put our imaginary hands on the controls and steer our thoughts and feelings in ways that we'd like them to go once we become aware of them. And again, not everybody can do that, I agree, but that assumption that people can do it is something that he makes without stating.
That's what bothers me. Now I'm listening to you, and I don't even agree with the word agency, maybe that I used there too. It's like saying, this is what I'm hearing. Be that an addiction, be that technology, be that anything, or you wanting to exercise or eat healthy. We all know what works, what's the correct thing, but it's hard for human beings to just have the power and the will and the agency to just do it. It's hard. And that's where my disagreement is. And he says that everybody can do that. No, I mean, do you know anything about human nature? I know that exercising 5 times a day, 5 times a week is great for me. Do I do that? No. Why? Is there something wrong with me? No, right? I'm a normal human. But what disturbs me is when he says, well, all our phones come with do not disturb or whatever button. He's like, just press the effing button and you'll be indestructible. You won't be tempted. It's not that easy. It's not that easy for this human being who had this childhood or this trauma or this brain to just push the button. Most people don't, and I couldn't articulate well. His approach sounded like a little shamey and blamey towards the user of the technology. And it didn't sit well with me. It is
I
not in my
know.
top favorites for sure.
I know. And I think this is one of those episodes that I wish that I had engaged with you in one of the support calls or in the Facebook group or someplace to discuss the episode, because look at the discussion we're having now. It could have been so cool to talk about it while it was still fresh in a way that maybe was even longer than we're able to have now. And
Yes, I agree. Let's continue. Anything else you have to say about that episode?
no.
No. Well, my number one, the number 3 episode for me is the episode with Pam Leo, the author of the Connection Parenting. She's an elderly woman in her 70s. She's a well-respected, beloved person by me and by many others. She's a grandmotherly figure. She talks about connection in parenting. And obviously, I love the way she says things. And I talked in the episode how her book influenced my work and shaped my thinking. I didn't even have a child then and that kind of stuff. But I think what stood out to me in this conversation was that point, I think it's towards the end, if I'm not mistaken, is the conversation about self-worth and self-esteem. How we become competent by doing things, and it's self-esteem. And that idea of self-worth and self-esteem, she said wonderful things that later put me on thinking about that topic for the rest of the year. So it triggered something in me to explore this topic a lot. And if you are a vigilant listener, I use that question in multiple episodes. I probed different guests. I asked Kristen Neff about self-worth and self-esteem. I asked Dr. Judy Ho. I asked several other guests when the time was appropriate, when we discussed about self-worth. And, it helped crystallize my ideas and thinking. So that was pretty potent and powerful for me. And she was very vulnerable towards the end. Of course, she shared very practical ideas as well about connection parenting, what connection is, and, how we can use connection instead of coercion with our children. And it's a good episode for someone who is new on the conscious parenting path with, I think that's like one of those basic essential episodes. I would recommend that. Yeah.
I think so too. And maybe that's why it's not on my top 5, is because it was one of those introductory ones. But I definitely had a friend very specifically in mind when I was listening to that I wish this person could hear this episode. I've sent her several episodes over the years. She doesn't want to hear it anymore from me about about connection parenting. It is not her jam. And okay, I get it. Some people do it differently. But that was certainly something that I took away too, now that you mention it, I do hear this self-worth and self-esteem question coming up a couple of times. When you mentioned that came from that episode, it surprised me a little bit in this conversation, because I was like, wait, wasn't that in the other episode? This one, it came from I see the thread now.
Because I'm writing a book, right? And a big part of one of the chapters of my book is about the biggest tool that parents can cultivate. And obviously, I'm thinking about different topics and this idea of self-worth. And I discussed it with Laura Froyen in one of the episodes. I believe it was either in the Harms of Gentle Parenting or the follow-up conversation to that one. We talked about self-worth, because I've been brewing in this idea a lot, and I have sharpened my ideas, and I will be writing in my book. And I think most people struggle with self-worth. And I'm going to say a bold statement that most of our afflictions come from low self-worth. Whether that self-worth came through trauma or through other experiences, for me, it doesn't matter as much as I want to help the person to cultivate deeper sense of self-love and self-worth and compassion, most importantly, because I believe that's the antidote to low self-worth and shame and guilt and lack of self-love. So I so clearly this year, this idea that most of our afflictions, addictions, troubles in the marriage, relational issues, everything, whether we achieve or not achieve, whether we, likes on Facebook and we ask for validation, lots of those things we do because of that low self-worth, worthlessness, or shame. And we are all on a spectrum, right? But I have never met anyone who hasn't dealt with this. And so, to varying degrees, we are all struggling with that. And I think self-compassion is a very powerful tool for that. Those are the two main things I sort of learned and connected and crystallized for myself this year.
Yeah, I love it. And that same subject shows up in my fourth one out of 5, which was the spring live event with Seth Gillihan, Finding Healing, Peace, and Joy. He talked about self-worth as well and how important that is as a premise for the steps that come next in finding healing and finding peace and joy. And in that episode, there was a lot of emphasis on acceptance, radical acceptance. And he defined, of course, that acceptance is not so much just floating through the world saying, it's fine that these bad things are happening to me. That's not acceptance. Acceptance is more like, boy, I wish this wasn't happening, but since it is, let me take a deep breath, accept that this is what's happening and not fight against that reality and figure out how I'm going to take my next steps, given the facts that this is what's occurring. And gosh, that is so freeing, that whole idea of radical acceptance as a foundation too, that other people are going to hurt us and say mean things and go after their own interests, and they're going to do things that we wish they didn't. And it's not just other people, but that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about acceptance, is accept that that's how they're behaving, and let's control only the part that we can, which is our response to that. And sometimes that involves communicating with them about how things are going, and sometimes it just means changing the way that we engage with certain relationships. But each of those decisions starts with the acceptance of the person is doing what they're doing. Let's not sit there and yell and scream and fight about how they shouldn't be doing things. So anyway, that other live event was also a very memorable one that I didn't go to with my family, but I did enjoy so much. It definitely hits my top 5.
Yeah, I didn't choose that because, again, I didn't want to put my own live events as my favorite episodes, but I really enjoyed that conversation immensely. And I think when you're speaking now, I'm like, did we talk about mindfulness? Because you have to be mindful to observe that you're resisting to this person or to this change, right? In order to accept. I believe he did talk about that. We did talk about that.
He did, and he had an interesting perspective on it because he said, let's shift attention to areas of ease in our body. Where do things feel just fine? We don't always need to focus on the parts that are uncomfortable and accept that this uncomfortable thing is happening. We can also accept that these good things are happening. And mindfulness of the body is one of the most accessible ways to exercise that awareness muscle, but it can go beyond our bodies and talk about all kinds of areas where we need to practice our acceptance. We did talk about mindfulness. Yeah, I enjoyed that so much. Thank you for putting these events on.
I know. Thank you for attending. You're my number one. I've thought about many times I'm going to make a t-shirt since you love t-shirts, and I got your t-shirt size wrong already one time. But I'm going to make a t-shirt that says number one fan.
Oh, that's funny.
That definitely, I have to create something for you. My next favorite episode, which wasn't so far in your top episodes, is the episode with Samir Chopra A Philosophical Understanding of Anxiety. And of course, I had Samir back again, just most recently, on a philosophical exploration of the notion of home with another fantastic individual and returning guest, Nina Manjand. Nina is a friend, she's a local person who became a friend. And a philosophical understanding of anxiety just changed how I understand anxiety completely. And it came into sharp focus. I've done so many episodes on the topic of anxiety. I have battled anxiety, most recently a lot more aware of it, that this is anxiety, but also throughout my life. And I didn't have a label. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was just fearful and neurotic. But looking back, I was anxious. But having done the podcast, I have changed how I approach anxiety, how I heal it in my body, my nervous system, the regulation, and not only my mindset about it, but I also, when I experience anxiety attacks, which are very rare in the recent years, I'm not scared. I'm not anxious about my anxiety anymore. And I know what I can do to minimize that sensation that it's going to dissipate and disappear. I mean, his writing is really poetic. He talks about philosophy, which I love. We have things in common with Samir. He's kind of an interesting individual because he's a philosopher. I love that. And with Nina and Samir, we decided to do more episodes together, the three of us, philosophical exploration of various topics in the future. So we're going to give it a try. We'll see how they come out. Maybe that needs to be its own podcast and not in this podcast, but we're going to record more episodes together. I also love that home episode. What is home? I didn't put it in my top 5, but it's, I love this guest. I love that topic, and it was really helpful. It was helpful for the listeners. One of the listeners called and sent something powerful, which resonated with her from this episode that I had found helpful as well. I can't think of off the top of my head. I don't want to take much time about this, but I want to hear your thoughts to this episode and what I just said.
Sure. Well, you hit my 5th one for sure. That was
it was?
We have in common. Yes. I also just absolutely loved that episode with Samir Chopra. It's funny because the one that you talked about with Nina and the one on home, for me was meh. It's not the thing that really engaged me as much as this one about the philosophical understanding of anxiety. And I think you're exactly right, because it was a completely new perspective on what anxiety is, that it has to do with this concept of our finitude, I think is the word, that our lives end. That's why we're anxious, is that I don't want to be spending this precious time that I have afraid of this thing that's coming, or dealing with this thing that's coming, or dealing with this thing that isn't coming. The concept of time attaching to anxiety is something that was really neat. And it showed up in another episode as well.
Yes, which is my other top favorite episode.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yes, these ideas were very, very novel. I'm really glad that you found these guests to talk about these topics, because it was really, really interesting. I loved, you talked about his writing being poetic. Yes, absolutely. And he brings quotes in so skillfully too. Other philosophers, from other experts, from other people who say things beautifully. And that is just such a it's rare to find that done so well. And he does that with incredible skill. I really, really love it. And my perspective on philosophy just generally is that I hold it as a secondary thing to the truth of scripture. And not everybody has that very clear distinction that I have. But what I loved about this episode was that each of the ideas that I wanted to revisit, it was just a short AI conversation to help me find the scriptures that supported these philosophical ideas. They weren't in conflict, which often they are, the ideas of philosophers and of scriptural teaching. They often don't align. but this did so beautifully that I think I treasure it extra because of that, because it aligns with beliefs I already hold. It ties into these beliefs just so beautifully. I don't have enough adjectives to talk about how much I appreciated this episode. And it's one of those ones I mentioned at the beginning that I didn't get to hear when it was released. I heard this episode just yesterday because I had missed it earlier in the year and had to catch up in order to prep for this conversation. And that is definitely one of the ones that I will re-listen to and see what else I can find from it. I loved it.
Yeah, not to mention when I read, it starts off me crying and him crying from the beginning because I read something from his book and I just couldn't hold it together. Because when he talks about losing love and loss, that's the root of anxiety, it's just so powerful. And yeah, but one thing he said, he also gives concrete tips. One of them was turn your anxieties into concrete fears. I love that advice. And I just remembered what one of my listeners, Ripsime, who is also Armenian, her biggest takeaway from this conversation. She also loved this conversation. She wrote, in fact, a long, long email to me describing how and why she loved this conversation. And one of them was, as we go into middle age, we, our project, we have to reevaluate our life. We're not going to go big, enlarge our life. We're going to shrink a little bit and focus on the most important and meaningful things. And he said it beautifully in this episode. And I highly recommend this episode, even if you think you're not struggling with anxiety. We all have anxiety, but people struggle with it differently. Some people have anxiety attacks and things like that, but we all have anxiety. And so, I can say so much about anxiety and what I learned through my podcast. Maybe we can do a whole nother episode. Yeah, I think I highly recommend this episode.
Yes, I'm just looking at the summary of this episode also. So much beauty in here about existential crisis, anxiety guiding us to what it is that we cherish, and how living life to the full is a burden that we would love to offload, that it is anxiety inducing. I agree. So much rich in this episode.
So what is your final fifth episode?
So that was my fifth. I think I'll use this chance to talk about my honorable mentions because we shared that.
Oh, that was your
anxiety
fifth
episode.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what were can you summarize your top 5 again?
Okay, my top 5 were Panic Proof, The Art of Communication and Relationships, Indistractable, Finding Healing, Peace, and Joy, and The Philosophical View of Anxiety. I got that title wrong,
anxiety. Yeah, yeah. Okay. And mine so far, I haven't revealed my fifth one, right?
You gave a hint in that conversation
Yes,
just now.
yes. I gave a hint. Yeah, that's right. So far, I have mentioned Connection Parenting episode with Pam Leo, Samir Chopra's episode that we have in common, A Philosophical Understanding of Anxiety, Trauma, Truth, and Transformation with Dr. Frank Anderson, and
Mind Wandering.
What was my first one? Oh, Mind Wandering. Sorry, my mind is wandering. Yes. And my fifth one, before you go to your honorable ones, because I don't have honorable ones, I have a competing one for number 5th position. And I'll be brief. My number 5th one is the episode with Oliver Burkeman about, again, loss, finitude, midlife, time management for mortals. I love his book. I've been obsessed with his writing, which is, again, beautiful and poetic. And he analyzes, again, philosophy and other writers very well and puts them together. It's just, to listen to him is so joyful. And it was an honor to have him on the podcast. It was in the works for many months. We had planned it and I was waiting for it for a long time. What a sweet individual he is. What a person of that magnitude, so humble and just a treat for me. I don't feel like I nailed that interview. I had so much to get out of him, but I sort of didn't, and I felt bad, but it's still my favorite episode because we managed to cover some of the key ideas that he talks about in his book in that episode. So again, it's a philosophical conversation, but it also has practical tools at the end, like the question I used in another episode with Dr. Laura Froen, which I use in my life now. Is this going to enlarge me or diminish me? It's a really good guiding question that he writes about. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed that episode too. And it's one that made me shop for a little while. I was window shopping on the internet for one of those not life in weeks calendars where you fill in a circle for every week that has gone by. And if you live to 90 years old, it's got that many spots on the calendar. And it's eye-opening how much of my time has already gone when looked at in that visual way. And it does change the way that we think about the projects we take on and the way that we spend our time. Perhaps the lingering in bed and scrolling on social media in the mornings is not as comfortable when looked at through the lens of, wait, I don't have all the time in the world. And I think competes with the idea we were just talking about, living life to the full as being anxiety inducing on its own. But at the same time, I think the ideas are very complementary, that we do want to be mindful of the time that we have and think about what our priorities are as we make decisions about how to spend our time. I enjoyed that one too. And I decided not to buy one of those calendars because I don't need the physical item to have that idea in my mind. But that's what I got out of that one. I enjoyed it too.
Yeah, I agree. It would be more anxiety inducing for me to see that my time is elapsing on this earth. It was revelatory just to do my calculation and learn that I'm 50 years old. Oh my gosh. I lived most of my life already, right? For sure, that's a fact. And it was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. But it helps us orient in life. Episodes like this are good reminders. It sounds like you are the same type of person as I am. Maybe not all listeners are like that, but we love cerebral, thought-provoking things and not only concrete parenting tips. And I feel like, I'm in a different place in my parenting. I have a teenager. While in the past, the podcast is 10 years old, I can't talk about potty training or about things that are not relevant to my life. Obviously, I have grown with the podcast. If you listen to the earlier episodes where my daughter was like 9 years old or 8 years old when I did the podcast, I talked about parenting issues, but as the time goes on, I grow as a person and I share what's relevant in my life, in my thinking, in my heart. And that's what it is. I don't want to create episodes that are solely about parenting per se and tips. Other people do that. And you can go and listen to those gurus and teachers. There's so much great information out there. That's not my jam. If you want to work with me as your parenting coach, I would be happy to do that. I enjoy working with parents, but I think I have to remain true to who I am and where I am in my life, what's relevant for me so that I can cover on the podcast. And people like you have grown with the podcast. I feel like we are aligned with our thinking and we understand and share similar ideas. I don't know. I find that listeners who reach out to me enjoy my episodes.
Yeah.
And those who don't, probably they don't enjoy and they go to other places for practical help. Like, it's okay. I can cover philosophical aspects of things, but that's what I enjoy and that's who I am. And, I want to
Sure.
remain
I
true
think
to myself.
what you're speaking to is the authentic part of authentic parenting, is being our authentic selves does require that we have this awareness of the scale of our own lives and the meaning of anxiety and all of these ideas we've discussed. Again, like you said, cerebral is a great word for it. In order to be my own person first, to be authentic, I do need to be, as you said, true to who I am and what I enjoy. And once I do that, then I can be there for my kids. I can show up for them in a way that isn't full of internal conflict and wondering whether I'm doing the right thing. Is this what I should be doing? What does the book say? I can much more confidently approach the everyday questions when I've got some of the bigger questions in the world rattling around in my head in a way that I'm happy with.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not coming across as insensible towards what the audience wants. They want concrete parenting tips and advice. I'm not coming from that place, or I'm not ignorant of that, right? And I know for sure when listeners post questions in our Facebook group, they are also aligned with our mentality. Like recently, an anonymous person posted a question about not wanting to attend their parents' funeral. Well, that's a really authentic parenting question, right? And the responses of people that poured in, it was just incredible. That made me so proud of where we are as a community. Nobody posts a question, help, my 6-year-old is not going to bed. We don't deal with those kinds of issues. There are other places for that. I'm not saying that's not important. You, as a mom of young children, you have a 10-year-old and 12, right? Maybe you do need parenting help. I don't know. But you guys never post in the group, as opposed to we discuss more personal development things in our Facebook group. And I notice they're not just any type of questions. They're very, again, cerebral, complicated questions that people raise that sometimes there are no answers to those questions. Like, should you attend, your mom's funeral, if you don't want to, or something like that? Yeah, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I have grown with the podcast and I can't be someone I'm not. And this podcast is a vehicle for personal development for me too. I can't be stagnant and talk about the same things. Bedtime routine, helping kids brush their teeth. That's not what I enjoy covering on the podcast. That's not my podcast. That's never been my podcast. And that will never be my podcast. This is what it is. I hope I haven't change the integrity of the show. Do you think it's still the same show predominantly that has grown, but it's still the same show as a listener?
I do think it's the same. And the reason I think it's the same is because you often, like I said earlier, bring back the parenting element into the personal growth conversation. A little bit like when we were talking about trauma. Okay, well, how can parents today protect their kids from these things? We're talking about trauma and recovering from our own wounds. Fine. There's a lot to discuss there. Entire books have been written on healing our trauma. And when we can connect it to parenting topics, that belongs on Authentic Parenting. And you do an excellent job of bringing up those connections, those ways that we can use these large ideas in our parenting. And some episodes you're more practical than others. But
that's when I feel guilty. That's when the guilt kicks in and I'm like, wait, we haven't done a parenting episode in a while. Maybe I should do one parenting, one personal development, and alternate. Some months I keep that. And then I fall into the same pattern that I want to take that path. It's so interesting that you noticed that. So what are your honorable mentions?
My honorable mentions. So there's a couple of them. First is self-compassion, because as you said, is the most important tool as parents, is being compassionate to ourselves for the mistakes that we make is what allows us to engage in the world in a way that we are just much more normal people when we can be self-compassionate. It changes a lot of things. And Kristin Neff is a treasure. I wouldn't want to go through a year where Kristin appeared on an episode and not mention her.
Well, that was my competing episode for number 5 spot. So I have Kristin Neff and Oliver Berkman.
Yes,
that was my.
I can see why. And then your episodes with Christy, colonoscopy and cannolis and death and cupcakes. More for the chemistry between you and her than the content itself. I just love listening to you two enjoy each other's company. So that's on my honorable mention for that reason. And then I have no shame about pumping my own episode. So Uncovering Our Core Values is the one that you and I did together. And I heard you mention it a few times in later episodes. So it's certainly a concept that makes its way into many conversations. So for that reason, I put it in my honorable mentions. And I have one more, and that's the one with Deborah McNamara about Nourish.
I wanted to put that on my top 5 too, but I decided not to because, yes, it's one in my top 16. Yes, I love that.
And kind of for the same reason as Kristin Neff, right? She is just a treasure and is so brilliant at the work that she does. Again, I couldn't possibly leave an episode like this one recapping the year and ignore the fact that her episode appeared in the year. But at the same time, personally, it unlocked something for me around the wounds that I have around food. I don't know yet what they are. But that episode showed me that I am not ready to deal with them. She talked about the value of nourishing our children and the connection and the relationship that can come through food. And my personal relationship with food, however complicated it is not equipped to carry that kind of weight. So there's a lot of work for me to do in this area. I don't really know what the work is. I will be talking to my therapist soon. But it was that episode that crystallized that for me, that I have a lot of work to do here. And I don't know yet what it is, but it exposed to me this gap that I have to address.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because that episode unlocked things in me too. And I'm hoping we're not the only ones. And the book is even deeper than what we covered on the podcast. That book received awards. It's a phenomenal work of art, if you will. That book also unlocked things in me, and it became sort of this ongoing prominent thing that I was aware of. And I think I mentioned in another episode that a neighbor brought food for me, which she always does. So I cook, I share some soups with her. She cooks, she shares soups with me. But that particular day, it hit me in a different way, that I was never nourished for the longest time. And that nourished me in that moment. And it just like that episode opened this channel and it clicked and I was crying and sobbing. And it was that episode that made me realize that you can eat, but you may not be nourished, and vice versa. You may not have enough food, which was the case for me. I've experienced both. I walked away from that episode thinking, wow, I had experiences where we had nothing to eat, the same food over and over, because that was humanitarian aid that was available for us, rice, let's say. But I felt nourished because where I was and who I was sharing that miserly meal with. And I was at this grand table after the earthquake, but I never felt nourished. And it was just so powerful for me. Those two ideas from that episode, yes, they unlocked things in me too. Wow, that's why we do this podcast. It makes me so happy. Are you ready for the reveal of the top 10 episodes?
Yes, lay it
on
us.
Because we can talk about all of the episodes for a long time.
We can.
And there are many, many good ones this year. I was like, oh my gosh, was this my best year? Yeah, maybe it wasn't my best year, but there were so many good ones this year. So the top 10 episode, drum roll. I'll go from the 10th position. And well, before I even mention the episodes, I want to say this. I haven't chosen the top 10. I have to mention this because on social media, one time I posted the top 10 of that year, and some person who doesn't even listen to my podcast commented, they're all white people in this top 10 list. There is no diversity. I'm like, I didn't choose it. The listeners chose those episodes. I do have diverse guests. And yes, maybe I can even diversify more, but this is not my own choosing. I didn't put white people on here because I am a white supremacist or whatever. No, this is based on the download numbers. And as you can see, the episodes released earlier in the year tend to get more downloaded, right? So they are in the top 10, obviously. So on the 10th position is Death and Cupcakes episode with Christy Loricella. She shared it a lot. We shared it a lot. It's a compelling title. I think people listen to this a lot. 9th place is the episode with Pam Leo, Connection Parenting. I forgot the exact title. How to use connection instead of coercion. Number 8 is another one of my favorite episodes with Laura Froyen, The Harms of Gentle Parenting. Number 7 is our common favorite, A Philosophical Understanding of Anxiety. I think many people loved it. Number 6 is How Changing Your Story Can Change Your Life with Nina Manjandre. As I said, she was a returning guest. Number 5 is How to Stop Holding a Grudge. This episode with Judith Rabinor, she is an 81-year-old woman who's appeared on the podcast multiple times. We talked about doing this episode, but I think the actual recording fell a little short for me than our prep conversation. I should have recorded the prep, but it's okay. It's in the top 10.
I enjoyed that one a lot
It's
too.
nice. I just love this person so much. Number 4 is why social media is toxic for women and girls. I guess that's a top topic. Technology was a topic I covered a bunch this year. And number 3 is profound truths about loss and grief that everybody needs to know. I love this episode, but this guest was so hard. We couldn't connect. She wasn't understanding my questions in the beginning. We had a really bumpy start. I was asking her a question. She goes, I don't know. What do you mean? What do you want to hear? I'm like, I don't know. It's a straightforward question. Like, so we had a very rough beginning, but I think it's a good episode. Number 2, and of course, this is an earlier episode, is Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself with Lisa Marciano. Lisa Marciano is the co-host of This Jungian Life podcast, another podcast I highly recommend. I listen to it every week. And this was a good conversation, but I feel like I felt short again. I wanted to ask her different things, but somehow I sometimes get sidetracked. I need Nir Eyal's book to be indestructible, to stay on topic. And the number 1, are you ready? It's an earlier episode. It is a favorite of mine too. The benefits of compassion for yourself and others. It's the first episode of the year with James Kirby. I really enjoyed that conversation. That conversation helped me understand the difference between kindness and compassion. I knew it, but the way he explained it, it was like, yeah, duh. So those were the top 10. What do you think of this list?
I love to see some of our favorites on there. And I wonder, I can't help but think as a data nerd, if there is a way to normalize the distribution of the download numbers to the number of weeks that the episode has been out, and if that would change the list at all. Because some of our more...
Yes, that's available. That statistics is available. Maybe I'm looking it wrongly.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm not doing an in-depth analysis. You're right. I just take the download numbers as they are, but I think this is wrong, right?
Not to say that those 10 aren't worthy of mention. Those are great episodes. You're right. It was a really good year.
Oh, so what do you suggest? How shall I look into this?
I suggest asking AI and to tell it the problem, right? That we have this tendency for the download numbers to favor the episodes that were released earlier in the year. And how could you compensate for the shortness of time that the more recent episodes have been available as you analyze the numbers to try to find the top episodes?
Yeah. Of course, the episode that was released on January 1st is going to have more throughout the year than the episode that was released on December 15th. We can't compare this to. But maybe I should look next year to this download numbers and see if they remain top 10.
Interesting question. Yeah.
Right? If the numbers increase.
That
Yeah.
list isn't going to go anywhere, so may as well save it and revisit it. Put a note on your calendar now.
Yes, I will do that. Thank you, my data nerd friend. Well, that is it for this episode. We shared our favorites. We shared your favorites. Unfortunately, this year we didn't hear from our listeners. That's kind of made me sad. I'm not going to lie. I was very, very disappointed. But what can I do?
Yep. Acceptance first, right? This is the situation and we made the best of it, I think. I love that I got to talk to you and monopolize the conversation of what the top episodes for us each were. Thanks for doing this with me. I feel honored that you choose me for this kind of stuff, and I always appreciate it. Thank you.
And of course, I always choose you for this kind of stuff. And that episode, Uncovering Your Core Values, that we did together, it's one of my all-time favorites from this podcast. I'm not exaggerating. I think what I'm going to do this year is I'm going to create like an essential listening list for my podcast from the 10 years. And that's going to be in the top list. If you are new to this podcast, you need to listen to that episode. Good parenting begins with knowing your values. And then later other things too, right? Like the healing, the trauma, and the needs, all of those things. But the values is so key, and that episode is so practical. I love it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had fun. Well, thank you for this. Have a fantastic new year. Happy holidays, and I cannot wait to do more episodes with you and to a good year.
Thank you for everything you do, Anna. I can't wait to see what 2025 brings.
Yay!